Another Brexit extension. I'm curious as to how you see this playing out, because it seems to be right now a tug of war between Brussels and Westminster, and one side pulls from the other and then the other side pulls from the one, and nobody's happy.
It's easy to get drawn into the minutiae here. I think the key thing to remember is that Boris Johnson backed Brexit in 2016 for one reason only, and that was to become Prime Minister. He's achieved that objective. Everything else is collateral damage. In practice, Boris's challenge is just to stay as Prime Minister. How can he do that? It's very difficult because he doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons. And in the British system, if you don't have a majority in the House of Commons, you will lose votes. And especially you'll lose if you're trying to get the House of Commons to vote for a general election. But that's okay. Boris stays Prime Minister. He doesn't seem to have been as badly hurt as I thought he might be by not delivering on Halloween. I think he still has considerable momentum so that when an election comes, he has some chance of winning a majority. So from Boris's point of view, this is the desired outcome. Everybody else is just left picking up pieces.
So that's personality-wise, but politically, where does Brexit leave Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the longer run?
Well, I'm glad you called it Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because the implication of Boris Johnson's deal is that Northern Ireland will have a different status from Great Britain. The United Kingdom will in that sense have a subtle division, assuming that this deal finally gets implemented. I think there are two things to watch here. One is, has Britain set itself on course for an ultimate reunification of Ireland? By creating this special status that leaves Northern Ireland de facto in the EU for trade purposes, has Britain unwittingly set Ireland on course for a slow process of reunification? If I were an Ulster Unionist, I would hate this deal. If I were in Sinn Féin, I would love it. Second point, Scotland. If you're going to treat Northern Ireland differently and leave it in effect in the EU for a time, the Scots might well say, as Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP leader, has said, well, what about us? We voted to stay. Scotland overwhelmingly backed Remain. And now I think the pressure for another referendum on Scottish independence is going to grow. And frankly, and I speak as a unionist, very much opposed to Scottish independence, I worry that this time, if there were another referendum, Scotland would actually vote to leave the UK. So if Brexit ends up meaning the breakup of Britain, the law of unintended consequences will seldom have a better illustration.
Niall, you've been a scholar, among other things, of integration in a time of globalization. Are we seeing disintegration now, and how quickly and easily will Britain be able to integrate itself into the global economy post-Brexit?
Well, one reason I was a Remainer was not out of great love for the European Union and Brussels. It was just the belief that the timing was wrong. Peak globalization is in the rearview mirror. The world is moving rapidly in the direction of protection. I pointed out earlier today in my talk at the Robin Hood conference that US average tariff rates are back where they were in 1948. And the idea that Britain is going to leave the EU and then conclude free trade agreements with the United States and other countries in a very short space of time just seems to me implausible. I rather agree with Philip Hammond that this is to underestimate how difficult it will be. And so even if Boris's deal goes ahead, the costs when it finally comes into effect are going to be quite significant, and it will be a slow process to create any compensating free trade agreements with the rest of the world.
We are right bang in the middle of the 90th anniversary of the 1929 crash, so let's talk about financial crises. You have talked about another asymmetric crisis being on the cards for Europe, where the northern countries might be okay, but the southerns won't. Germany is not as good. Germany is not as well positioned as it was last time around. When do you see another crisis coming, and what will it look like?
Well, things have changed a lot, partly because of Donald Trump's trade war, not just with China, but with the world generally. An economy like Germany's, which is heavily reliant on manufacturing exports, disproportionately is affected if the world moves away from free trade. And that's why the underperformer in Europe is now the core economy, Germany. And what goes around comes around. Greece is doing well because the populists are out of power, and they have in Kyriakos Mitsotakis a really quite good new prime minister. So a lot has changed in Europe. What hasn't changed is the fundamental mismatch between monetary union and lack of fiscal union. Very little has changed since the crisis. There has been only a minuscule step in the direction of banking union and none at all in the direction of fiscal union. And now Europe's leaders tell us they're going to achieve growth with a carbon-free strategy. I don't believe that that will generate growth. I think in practice it will only add to the costs that already weigh down German industry. I mean, German industry already pays much more for energy than French industry. So I'm skeptical about the Green New Deal that Ursula von der Leyen is promising Europe. I suspect that it will contribute to low growth. And under those circumstances, with low growth, populists are going to continue to do well. Look at what just happened in the German state election in Thuringia. And ultimately, at some point, the Italian debt problem is going to come back. It's gone away for a bit, but I can assure you it will be back, as will the refugee problem. Because if relations with Turkey and the West get worse, the refugee problem could be back with a vengeance in a short time. So a lot of problems are waiting in the wings for Europe. And I remain of the view that the history books in the future will describe Brexit as a footnote in a bigger chapter on the disintegration of Europe. It will be a slow 10-year-long process, but I think it's already underway.
So you still believe that the monetary union will see countries peeling off?
I think the monetary union was a historic mistake. I think that was predictable at the time. Some of us said a monetary union without fiscal union would be inherently unstable. It's not that people will leave the monetary union, because it's very hard to leave the monetary union. It's more that other parts of Europe will begin to fragment. And particularly on immigration, I think it will be impossible to have a common European policy. So the monetary union will live on as a kind of vestige of the dream of a federal Europe. But on all major policy issues, nation states will be making the decisions, and Brussels will get progressively weaker over time. There won't be a day when they wake up and declare the European Union dead. It will be like the Holy Roman Empire. It will fade away.
Let's talk about China. Obviously, we're in the middle of a trade war. There seems to be a phase one deal. At least the administration here in the US is touting that. May or may not get signed in Chile. How dangerous is this trade war in your view?
Well, it's dangerous in the sense that markets currently expect it to end. And this, I think, explains the currently relative strong state of US equities. There's a good deal of confidence that something meaningful is coming. But when you look at the small print, all that's really coming with phase one is a postponement of further tariff hikes. And as I said, the US has already gone back to its protectionist stance of 1948. And that has all kinds of implications for the global economy. Supply chains are going to start moving away from China the longer this lasts. And my sense is that the most likely scenario is that the trade war in its present form continues. The most that's going to be achieved is going to be a postponement of further tariff hikes. And there's still a possibility, knowing Donald Trump, that he hikes at some point between now and election day. It's as likely to me that tariffs go up as that they come down in the coming year. Markets are way too optimistic. There's not going to be a major trade deal between the US and China as long as Robert Lighthizer is handling the negotiations on the US side and Xi Jinping is handling them indirectly through Liu He on the Chinese side. They're far too far apart on all the key issues, and my broad view is that the US-Chinese relationship is heading towards greater antagonism, not only over trade, but also over technology and geopolitics, to the extent that we've already entered Cold War II. It's just that the market hasn't noticed.
So which economy is better positioned to withstand something like that then? I mean, what if, for example, a wave of Chinese nationalism sees the Chinese only buying Chinese goods?
I think that's not a huge problem, frankly, for the United States. It might well be a bigger problem for China. I've always said that this is asymmetrical, that globalization is more important to China than it is to the US. Look, the Chinese have done a good job of offsetting the impact of the trade war on their economic growth, mostly through monetary policy, allowing the currency to weaken. But in the end, it's extremely difficult for Chinese policymakers to maintain a 6% growth rate for the next 10 years. The demographics are against them, and the leverage has really reached such a height that it's hard to imagine any more debt being used to keep growth going. So my sense is that the prolongation of the trade war is on balance worse news for China than it is for the United States, but that Xi Jinping has taken the decision to play tough. Remember, he could have settled earlier this year, but they backed away from a deal at the very moment when it seemed to be about to be done. And I think that's because Xi Jinping thinks that on the whole, Cold War II, while it might be economically painful, is politically quite good for him. It justifies his dominant position in Chinese politics.
Does this end up being the election issue that decides whether or not President Trump gets re-elected? And I know you've called this period a period of catharsis. So I'm curious, do we have another 4 years?
It's more likely than not that President Trump gets re-elected. It's really hard for me at this point to imagine any of the front runners beating him. The prediction markets like the look of Elizabeth Warren. I'm very doubtful that voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin will take her over Donald Trump if that's the choice. I don't think China's the number one issue, though. I mean, President Trump may try to make it the number one issue, but the Democrats can probably go head to head on China with him and be equally tough. After all, the Democrats historically have been rather tougher on China than Republicans. The number one issue is healthcare. The polls make it very clear, and especially in the swing states. And this is a problem for President Trump in that the Republicans don't have a good answer to the question, what did you do about healthcare? What was a problem for Democrats became a problem for Republicans when they failed to repeal and replace Obamacare. So for President Trump, it's very important between now and November of next year that the conversation be about foreign policy rather than domestic policy, and that his toughness, getting rid of al-Baghdadi, for example, is the thing that voters are thinking of when they go into the polling booth. That's why I think the China issue matters. It's not the number one issue for voters, but President Trump, with his undeniable mastery of social media, may make it the number one issue if he thinks it's electorally advantageous.